There's a war in American history that lasted 6 years which you've never heard of, and that's not an accident, because it was a war over rent, and the people who fought it won. So let's go back to the beginning, because oddly enough it starts with someone you wouldn't expect to have a problem with rent. A doctor. His name was Smith Boughton, and he wasn't the kind of man you'd expect to lead an armed rebellion. Born in 1810 in a small town east of Albany, trained at a little medical college up in Vermont, and by his 30s, he was riding between farmhouses, delivering babies and setting broken bones. In 1838, he got married. He was respectable, the kind of guy the whole valley trusted. But Boughton had done something most country doctors hadn't. A year earlier, in 1837, he'd left everything behind and gone north to Canada to fight. Farmers up there were rising up against the British government, and Boughton went and joined them. He got caught. They threw him in prison, and then they kicked him out of the country and sent him home. It wasn't the only time he would go to prison, but we'll get there later. This was a man who had already picked up a gun for a cause once, and already sat in a cell for it. When he came home to New York, he found people right there in his own hills with big problems. So what were these farmers actually so angry about? Well, say you're one of these farmers. You've got 100 acres up in the hills. You cleared the trees off of it yourself. You built the house, dug the well, put up the barn. What do you owe your landlord for that? During times of financial constraint, you owe him wheat, 10 to 20 bushels of it, hauled to him every harvest. You owe him 4 fat hens, and you owe him a day of your own labor, showing up with your horse and wagon to work for him on a date he picked, the 2nd of January every year. You pay the taxes on the land, not him. And anything valuable on that land, the timber, the water, whatever's under the ground, that's his, not yours. You just live on top of it. But there is another problem to this whole ordeal. You could never buy your way out. The rent went on forever. When you died, your kids inherited the farm, and they inherited the exact same bill. And if you ever got desperate enough to sell the lease, the landlord took a quarter of whatever you sold it for. Does that sound fair to you? You could pour your entire life into that farm. 3 generations of your family could be buried on it, and not one of you would ever own it. Now, if you know your history, you might be thinking, wait, this is America. Didn't we get rid of this kind of thing? We did, sort of. In 1787, New York State passed a law that banned feudal land deals, exactly what these farmers had. So how did it survive? Well, the landlord had a very good lawyer. His name was Alexander Hamilton. One you might recognize on the $10 bill. He was the landlord's brother-in-law, and he sat down and drew up a new kind of contract to get around the law. His trick was very simple. He didn't call it a lease. He called it a sale, an unfinished one. On paper, the farmer was in the middle of buying it, and of course, he could never finish paying. That was the whole point. So Founding Father personally wrote the paperwork that kept a feudal system running on American soil, and it worked. It held up in court for the next 60 years. But there's something even stranger here. We fought a whole revolution to get away from kings and lords. So how did the lords survive it? Well, yet again, that's something they don't typically teach you about. 1 year after the Declaration of Independence, the New York legislature passed a law saying that nothing about this new free country would touch any land grant the old king had handed out. And guess who was sitting in that legislature? The Van Rensselaers, the Livingstons, the same landlord families writing the rules to protect themselves. Now, the revolution did destroy some of these estates. If you were a landlord who backed the British, you lost everything. Families like the Phillipses and the Delanceys got their land seized, sold off, and were run out of the country for good, all because they backed the wrong side. So the war for freedom, that we still throw fireworks for every summer, didn't free these farmers from anything. It just made sure the right landlords kept them. And for a long time, this arrangement kind of worked, because of one man we've been talking a lot about as, quote-unquote, the landlord. His name was Stephen Van Rensselaer, and he owned an area bigger than some current states, something like 700,000 acres, with tens of thousands of people living on it. On paper, he was one of the richest men in America. Such wealth would traditionally make him sound like a dick, but no, he was actually pretty nice. When a farmer couldn't pay, he let it slide. He took chickens and grain instead of cash. He let people fall years behind and never threw them off the land. The tenants loved him for it. They called him the good patroon, and for most of their lives, the rent was something they owed on paper but rarely had to fully pay. Then, in 1839, he he died. The war would start a year later. You see where this is going yet? No? Well, let me tell you about this man's quote-unquote kindness. When they opened his will, Van Rensselaer had died deep in debt himself, so his will ordered his sons to go collect. Every year anyone had fallen behind, all of it called in at once to pay off his estate. The farmers had thought they were being forgiven. They weren't. The bill had just been sitting there the whole time, growing, waiting for the one day the nice man was gone. So the sons sent out the bills. Decades of back rent all at once, in the middle of a bad economy, and the farmers couldn't pay. What a surprise. Still, the farmers tried doing it the right way, or at least somewhat the right way. They gathered on a mountainside on the 4th of July, 1839, and wrote up their own Declaration of Independence from the Landlords. They sent petitions to the state government. They asked the legislature to look at these leases and see how insane they were. They took it to court. They did everything you're supposed to do in a country like this. You have a problem, you go through the system. And the system did nothing. The court sided with the landlords, because on paper, the leases were legal, thanks to Hamilton. Year after year, the answer was the same. Pay what you owe, or get off the land. So put yourself in their shoes. You've asked nicely, you've asked legally, you've asked for years, and every door has been shut in your face. What would you do? And this is where our doctor comes back. Buten looked at all those closed doors and decided there was only one thing left. If the law wouldn't protect the farmers would protect themselves. So he helped build a secret army. And they did it with the sense of theater you have to admire. The men dressed in bright calico, cut from their own wives' dresses, and pulled sheepskin masks over their faces, painted up in reds and blacks. They took names like Big Thunder, which is what they called Buten, and they armed themselves. Their alarm system was the best part. Every farm kept a tin dinner horn, the kind you'd blow to call the family in for supper. When a sheriff showed up to evict someone or collect rent, that horn started blowing. The next farm heard it and blew theirs, and within minutes, before that sheriff could do anything, he'd be surrounded by hundreds of armed men in masks who had come out of nowhere. Thousands of farmers signed up. Whole counties were organized this way. Wait, no, maybe the alarms weren't the best part. Look at their costumes. Those whole things? They were dressed like Indians. Part of it was cover, sure, masks hide your face, but they were also copying the Boston Tea Party, where the founders had done the exact same thing. They were saying, "This is us, we're the real patriots now," and there was a second message underneath it. They were dressing as the people whose land had been taken first, to argue that the patrons never really owned any of it to begin with, which is a bold thing to claim while standing on that same land yourself. They knew it, and they did it anyway. For a while, it worked. Sheriffs couldn't do their jobs, evictions stopped, the masked men ran the hills. But it couldn't stay a costume party forever. In December of 1844, Buten went to a place called Smoky Hollow to give a speech. A huge crowd turned out to hear Big Thunder, thousands of people, and he stood up with his guards around him in full costume. By all accounts, it was the biggest day of his life. And in the middle of it, a young man in the crowd, a bystander named Riffenberg, was hit by a stray pistol, shot and killed. Nobody meant to kill him. It was an accident. But it didn't matter. A boy was dead, and Big Thunder was standing right there in his war paint. Buten sent everyone home. There would be no speech. That night, they came for him. He was arrested, and the charge, oddly enough, wasn't about the dead boy at all. Months earlier, Buten had stopped a sheriff, taken a stack of foreclosure papers off of him, and burned them. They threw him in Hudson jail. Some questionable trials followed with people fighting in court apparently, and in the end, they sentenced him to life in prison over burning the paper. But then it got worse. In August of 1845, over in Delaware County, a sheriff's team rode out to a farm owned by an old man named Moses Earl. Earl was behind on his rent, so they came to auction off his cattle to cover it. Leading them was an undersheriff named Osmond Steele, a man who had made it his personal mission to break the anti-renters. The horns started blowing. The masked men gathered, shots were fired. Steele was hit 3 times, and he died that same day. This was the turning point, as a dead deputy was something the public couldn't shrug off. Overnight, opinion turned against the whole movement. The governor declared the county to be in a state of open insurrection and sent in hundreds of troops. They built new jails just to hold everyone. Nearly 100 men were convicted. Some got life. 2 were sentenced to hang. The judge told the jury that simply showing up in disguise at that farm made a man guilty of murder, whether he fired a shot or not. But it wasn't the end of it. The people who fought it won. But how? Well, obviously they couldn't win in the courts, so they went somewhere the landlords couldn't rig as easily: the ballot box. There were tens of thousands of these farmers, and they started voting as a block. In the very next election for governor, they threw their weight behind a man named John Young, and they put him in office. They essentially elected their way out. Once Young was governor, he did two things. He commuted the death sentences, so nobody hanged, and in 1847 he pardoned the anti-renters sitting in prison, Buten among them. Big Thunder walked out a free man. Meanwhile, a new state constitution in 1846 finally banned these feudal leases outright. So, on paper, the farmers had won everything, but paper is where this whole story has always played its tricks. The new constitution only banned new feudal leases. The old ones, the ones these families were already trapped in, those it didn't erase. They were still valid contracts. And the landlords weren't done. The courts kept going back and forth for years. At one point, a ruling basically said the Van Rensselaers no longer had a real claim to the land, and that should have been the end of it. Instead, the family sold their pile of old leases to a ruthless land speculator named Walter Church, who bought the damaged goods cheap and then spent the next 40 years dragging farmers into court, thousands of lawsuits, to squeeze the old rents out of them anyway. Sheriffs kept showing up. Families kept getting thrown off land they'd worked for generations. As late as 1869, another deputy was shot dead trying to collect on one of these leases. The thing just would not die. In the end, the farmers mostly got their land, one negotiated buyout at a time, often paying again for the soil their grandparents had already paid for twice over. Buten lived a long life. He died in 1888, an old man, having watched the whole thing play out. So why don't you know any of this? Maybe for a reason, as the lesson underneath it is a little dangerous. We're taught the way things are owned is just how it is. Somebody holds the deed, somebody pays the rent, and that arrangement feels as old and as permanent as the ground itself. These farmers were told the exact same thing. Your family will owe this family forever, and there's nothing you can do about it. And they looked at all of that, and they decided it wasn't permanent after all. They were right. So here's my question for you, and I actually want to hear it in the comments. Was what these farmers did justice, or was it just crime that happened to win? And how would that translate to the world today? And if you want to see another piece of American history they quietly left out of the textbook, go watch this one next. I think you'll see why it got buried too.